All right, so in this section, we're going to take the ideas of expansive place from the last video and then really discuss what each of those principles, those four principles, look like when we put them into teaching practice. Now, the whole point of this framework of place is that it is going to be very specific to individual settings, but there are themes of what we might be trying to aim for. So, in setting up here, a point I want to make is that all aspects of place are continually inseparable, right? And so a lot of times we want to feel like we can carve off a corner because that's more intellectually approachable, but that's no longer place itself. So as a science teacher, I very often wanted to just deal with maybe the geology or ecology of a place, right? Because that's a lot more approachable. But the geology doesn't exist separate from the social aspects, the cultural aspects, right? None of these exist separately, right? They only exist with the place as a whole, right? And so there can be the temptation that we just want to carve off our little piece and that is more approachable, but that no longer represents the reality of what the place is. So the first principle is just exposing more students to place, right? There's an assumption that kids know what's around them. And to an extent that's true, but in many ways it's not, right? And the reality is that exposure to especially nature and outdoor settings is just really, really rather low right now. A point I like to try to make, the iconic work in this area is Richard Louv's The Last Child in the Woods, right? And he lays out this strong argument for how many fewer children are being outdoors. And if you really think about his work, right, that published in 2005, the generation here he's discussing, right, because he was discussing about 10-year-olds at the time, are the parents of elementary students right now, right? And by far, the largest predictor of whether someone pursues activities in nature or outdoors is having some sort of role model, typically a parent, right? The challenges he discusses in that book, and if you're someone that's familiar with it, the challenges have gotten exponentially worse from that. This photo here, one of the things that always amuses me with my research now, I'm often taking students outdoors, and most of them just really do not have any experience. So these two students had never camped before. It was their first time roasting a hot dog on a fire, right? Things that for me growing up were really pretty common experiences, things that you're just like, oh, well, everyone's done that. They very much have not, right? And these are two college students who are great students, but those are just not experiences that are common for most children. And for the most part, in a lot of ways, exposure to place is largely a matter of privilege. I like to make the point of when teachers say, well, we don't have time to include these environmental topics, we have to do blank. Now, one, what is it that you're teaching that exists separate from place? Because that's sort of its whole own discussion, right? But when you make that decision, my personal children will still get exposure to place, right? They'll still be in nature, they'll still get to explore environmental topics. And that's not because of like any moral superiority, but that's a matter of privilege, right? And having parents that have the educational background to create those sorts of opportunities, have the financial flexibility to create those sorts of opportunities. And so in a lot of ways, choosing to expose students to place is not about making a decision that, okay, well, none of my students will have these opportunities because we just don't have time. It's actually a decision that my less privileged students are not going to have these opportunities. right? The ones that are privileged still will. Their parents will be able to create that, but the ones who are less privileged will not. Another example in terms of just exposure to place, and especially like the immediate place right around you. I still remember teaching middle school, and I don't remember the exact discussion or how it came up, but I showed a picture of a pronghorn, and had a student go, "Oh, well, where do those live?" I remember being kind of shocked because they're like, "Well, here, right? Like, there's actually a herd that I pass on my commute, right?" I would guess for a lot of you, as educators, students are much more familiar with the wildlife of the Serengeti than they are the wildlife of their own figurative backyards, right? So just getting students outdoors and exposed to place in some regard. Kind of as an extension of that, some of your sort of educational facilities which could contribute towards understandings of environmental topics, zoos, nature center, things like that. Even stuff that you might be like, oh, well, all students will have been to that's in town. Likely not the case, right? Sure, some will, many will, but even if you have a state park, nature center, zoo, things like that close, and be like, oh, well, all students will have been exposed to that. There's a very good chance that they have not, especially if it's not been something the school has done. The next goal is that we're just exposing students to more places, right? So maybe that's pictures, maybe it's videos, maybe it's a field trip, right? So in exposing students to place, maybe we're just going outside and observing what's around us on school grounds. This could just be an opportunity to show students places that are different from where they are, right? And something that's really important with this is that it can change the idea of I understand a topic to I understand a topic here, right? I understand this idea where I am, but maybe not elsewhere. Especially topics like weather, right? Maybe we use examples of videos or readings or things to bring in an exposure to what this might look like other places in comparison to where we live, or where you are. It also, exposing students to more places allows for a consideration of differences between communities, both human and ecological, right? So there's a lot of times that if our depth of experience is just with one particular place, that's very limiting. And that never really forces us to think critically about the comparative differences between places. And in that, perhaps opportunities or challenges that should be addressed or things that can be changed. Our next one is exposing students to place in more context. And what this is that we're giving more cognitive tools to explore a place. A role model for me as an educator, from my own background, is Dr. Dave Lageson, who's a geologist at Montana State. One of the things that fascinated me by his work as an educator, I took a few geology courses from him during my master's. Obviously, he knows the ecology of his area, the geology, pardon, incredibly well, right? He knows how things formed, what's at play, all of those things, right? And in Southwest Montana, down toward the Yellowstone area, obviously very geologically active, right? That's to be expected. He also knew the ecology well. He knew the history incredibly well. And so he added a lot of these very rich context from other fields that gave a lot more depth of meaning. It also allowed for a lot more consideration of the sort of interdisciplinary nature of a place, right? That we aren't just looking at this feature geologically, but ecology is a factor, culture is a factor, the cultural changes, right? So the indigenous communities and values and meanings they gave to a place, how that's changed, how the treatment of the place has shifted, what a place may have meant to a particular culture, right? Giving those more cognitive tools, especially in middle school and high school, we tend to get in the mindset of, I am a blank subject teacher, and that's my focus, right? But that can be very limiting in that we're only giving one set of cognitive tools. We're only giving the science tools, social studies tools. But places are interdisciplinary, they're complex. And so giving more context, maybe that involves incorporating another teacher, but it gives a lot more meaning, right? Really considering the interdisciplinary nature of the place. And finally, considering exposing students to more perspectives of place. So what meaning have others ascribed to this place? What meaning do others ascribe to this place? And that really is critical in that lets students start to see a place as a social construct. So what do others think of this? What do others see? What do others experience? That also sets up opportunities for discussions of equity, right? So if we see and we start to learn about perspectives of a place that maybe we recognize that, oh, there are these perspectives, but those aren't really discussed as much or celebrated or publicized, right? That provides a lot of social depth toward discussing place or environmental topics, which is a much richer experience than if our aim or our outcome was just a multiple choice test to check for content retention. And so again, each of these are going to look very different depending on what it is you're teaching, where it is you're teaching. But as a matter of practice, those set up kind of goals of, all right, in this lesson, do I just want to expose students to the place that's around them? Am I trying to expose them to more places? Am I trying to give them more context, like more cognitive tools, more interdisciplinary content area type tools to explore the place? Do I want them to understand what others value or see in a place? But those are all aims which are much richer, are more reflective of the nature of place itself, and are going to lead to a much more impactful experience for students, which is really what we should be aiming for with environmental education.